Sometimes, sometimes, in fact, people travel even on top of the train sometimes because they're desperate, and the trains are overloaded. There's no denying it. But even if the trains aren't overcrowded, a lot of people do ride on the footboard. Partly, it's a very Mumbai expression we call "hawa khane ko," because it's humid, it's hot, and so yeah. So some people do it because there's no space, and some people do it just for the fun of it. And the story is about one such girl. This woman is so transparent, the evil eye cannot fall upon her. Perhaps the evil goes right through her body, falling on the person standing right behind her in queue for the renewal of a second class pass. Not that she travels second class, she travels first class bindas. Who can challenge her? She wears sleeveless tops and big dangly earrings, just like a college girl. She has an office job and a faux leather handbag with a Hello Kitty clasp that she polishes once a week with brass soap. Nobody would look at her and say that she doesn't look first class. Besides, in the terrible crush of the morning, no ticket examiner dares enter the compartment. No commuter could be expected to reach into her purse to extract a ticket or pass. All arms are trapped, pressed, pinned down by a dozen other arms and shoulders. All the ladies must suck in their bellies and squash each other's breasts as they make their way from seat to aisle to door. There is safety in such crowds. Even so, she is aware that luck is on her side. Night after night, she travels in the first class coach when it is near empty. In 4 years, not once has any ticket examiner shown up and asked to see her ticket. For this, she is grateful. Also, for the cop who is on duty in the ladies' compartment after 9 o'clock. His khaki uniform made her nervous at first, she being a lawbreaker of sorts. However, as the weeks went by, she decided that his presence was further evidence of her good luck. She feels safe, no matter how late she travels. The best time to travel in this city is between 9:30 and 10:30 p.m. After that, it feels like Russia all over again. At 11 p.m., gents are allowed to board the second class ladies' coach. But the ladies refuse to be squashed into any coach with gents, tickets be damned. So they come pouring into the neighboring coach, the first class, which is reserved for ladies all 24 hours. This is usually the family crowd, mothers with children in tow, big noisy groups. These women know none of the unspoken rules of train etiquette: how to sit, how to stand, where to get off. If you snap at them, they expect sympathy. They expect you to give up your seat just because they're carting babies. She makes it a point to turn her head away, smiling the barely restrained smile of the long suffering. She has learned how to do this from first class ladies. They rarely scream or shout when the irregulars invade the compartment. Instead, they exchange glances and roll their coal smudged eyes. They think they can tell who is or isn't first class at a glance. Tacky gold lace edging a sari, lots of bracelets, flashy red sindoor in the parting of their hair, polyester burqas, flushed faces, high-pitched voices, and above all, their easy excitability. It's a picnic for them being out in a local train. Some nights, a first-class pass holder will lose her cool. She will snap at one of the second-class ladies, asking her to mind where she steps, pointing out that this is first class. Then some of the other ladies will chime in. How much we tolerate, but these people take advantage of our silence. Now, if only a ticket examiner would show up. The way we are suffering, we don't get to sit down even at 11 at night. What's the point of paying for a first class pass? Pointless. Some nights, the ladies turn on the cop who is traveling with them, their indignant voices rising. What's the use of having a policeman with us if he cannot enforce the law? Why doesn't he throw them out? They're not satisfied with getting into first class. Now they want a seat too. All of us are fools who pay for the first class. We stand here and look at their faces. Just look at them. They're sitting there grandly as if their father owns the railway. He can hear them despite his earphones. She can tell from the way he carefully keeps his face averted, the way he stares out into the dark night. He ignores their indignation, doesn't say a word. She likes this about him. She knows he boards the train at Churchgate. She herself boards at that station and is careful not to look him in the eye as she enters the coach. She picks a seat so she can sit with her back turned to him. She kicks off her yellow slippers with their bright blue straps, puts up her feet on the empty seat across. Idly, she speculates on the shape of his wife. His moustache suggests a wife. His belly suggests a wife. What does she want with a man who has a wife waiting at home? I'll stop here.
Thank you, Annie. So I just actually want to lead off from the introduction, which is that was there any conscious reason why you decided to write about the people that you did? And how did you come to these stories? Like, was there sort of like a conscious thought, or was this sort of things that, you sort of in passing came to and then collected together to make this sort of interconnected book? So let's start with how these stories came to be.
I think when I started writing, I wasn't sure that I was writing a book at all. But a lot of these stories, if you see that this is called City of Incident, a novel in 12 parts. So there are 12 chapters in the stories of 6 men and 6 women. In each chapter, I try to build on a character, and then that character relates to the next character and so on. But what I was working off was not really characters so much as images. I've lived in Mumbai many years. I'm not there right now, but I think that is the city that I'm most familiar with. It's the city now where I've spent the most number of years. I know it best. And because I've also worked there as a journalist, I kind of, there were bits and pieces of things that I saw and kind of that got kind of burnt into my memory, and I couldn't shake off those images. So for instance, some of these images are things I've seen, and some of these images are things I've read about. And I think because I couldn't forget them, and because these images also informed my relationship with the city. For example, there is an image of a baby inside a plastic bag, and that's something that I had read about very early in the first few years of me moving to the city. And it's not something that happens a lot in the city. You know, it happens very rarely, much less actually. That babies being abandoned inside or infanticide, for example, is not as common in Maharashtra as it might be elsewhere. But because I first heard about such things when I was in Mumbai, and because you see these garbage dumps and you read about babies being abandoned, and then you cannot, because I was so young and so shocked, I hadn't heard and hadn't imagined such things. Each time I walked past one of these giant rubbish dumps, somewhere my mind would just hover around that image. It would keep circling, worrying around that image. What if there's so many plastic bags, so many things just left abandoned? What is inside them? How do we know? Does one touch it? Does one not touch it? Does one take an interest? Does one not take an interest? And this is something that you can't ever get rid of. Once the idea is in your head, for 20 years, I walked around with this one question in my head, that should one pay attention to little bags that are lying abandoned somewhere? People tell you, don't touch anything that's lying abandoned. How can you not want to touch it? Once you know that, you don't know, could be a baby, could be a little kitten. You don't know what's inside, right? So these were some of the things, and I think as with each passing year, something would, you know, you'd read a report about somebody who fell to their death, and this thing, the city is full of high rises, right? We're a city of high rises. Um, do people fall or do they jump? In under what circumstances can one determine? How does one determine what is a fall, what is a jump? Every day in the city, people are cut down on the railway tracks. Very early in my career, I used to work with Midday at the time. One of the stories I did was about the statistics of people who die on the railway tracks. A lot of them actually fall because they hang out of the trains. And of course, the railways keeps telling you, that's why they tell you don't stand on the footboard and travel. They don't. So some of them get knocked down because because it's so overburdened, the train. Some of them because they cross the tracks. But perhaps some also because they're not, because it's a conscious decision. And I remember one day the train was very late, and people get impatient very easily in Bombay. So, people were kind of peering out and saying, what's the matter? Why is the train late? Why is the train late? Why isn't it moving? And it turned out that there was a woman who was deliberately kind of crouching in front of the train, So, so these are the kind of things which I couldn't forget. I mean, you live in the city, and I think writing the book was one way of me trying to come to grips with the city itself. Not so much with my life in the city, but what is the meaning of living in a city like this? And how do lives intersect? How are lives? You can't, even if you wanted to, you couldn't really separate yourself from others in the city. So I think the book comes from there, that my all these different images, these happenings, these incidents, and my attempt to perhaps articulate certain lives, which are imagined. They're not, obviously, I don't know about the real people and, in those incidents, but my attempt to come to terms with it, really.
I find it very interesting that you talked about connection, because the sense one gets from reading these stories, especially, is that sense of deep loneliness, the bubble of solitude that surrounds each of the sort of narrators within their own sort of, issues and problems. They are lonely with their problems within this sort of great mass of humanity. And particularly the abandonment of certain individuals. I mean, there is a literal abandonment, of course, like the baby is abandoned, but there is also a sense of abandonment for the narrators, that they are either abandoned by the system, as with the beggar. They are either abandoned by their husbands and people who should be caring for them. So was there a conscious decision to sort of have, with the intertwining narratives, to have this sort of thread of loneliness and, sheer sort of solitude within each of the sort of narrators? It is visible for some, obviously, and there's an underlying sort of subtlety in some of the others, where it's not like Miss First Class Bindas is not obviously lonely, but that she does think about her baby. She thinks about the cop in the car, and she wonders what his life is like. So she's obviously trying to forge some sort of connection, which she is unable to do. But was there any reason why you specifically chose this thread of loneliness and,
I don't think it was conscious, Sharon, but I think I am drawn to lonely people. I mean, Wispy mentioned my book Love Stories before, and some people have commented on how they're all kind of, except for one, almost all are a little sad. I think one of the things that I think it's what I think, was it Tolstoy who said that, all happy families are alike, but everybody who's unhappy is unique. Unhappy families are unhappy in separate ways.
I think to make a more recent cultural reference would be, I don't know if you watch Fleabag, but season 2 of Fleabag begins with the narrator looking directly at the main character, looking directly to the camera and saying, "This is a love story." And then, of course, spoiler warning for everybody, but she gets abandoned by the end. So, like, this is a love story. It doesn't mean it's going to turn out happily. So that is very much the sense that I get. Do continue. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Not at all, not at all. Interesting you say that, because actually, if you see, City of Incident is also a love story. There are many love stories within it, and some of those love stories fail for economic reasons, some just because things happen and they're out of control. And of course, in a way, it's my love for the city too. I think, to answer your question, I think with loneliness, I also feel that in a way, everybody is lonely. Even people who never appear lonely on the surface or are surrounded by people, there are always times or little flashes, or, there'll be 1 hour in the day in which suddenly loneliness will grip you. You've just come back from meeting with your friends, you've gone to a party and you've come back and you're suddenly lonely. And I find that interesting to write about, because that is also, in a way, a more truthful moment, I feel. When you're constantly surrounded by people, you're filling up the hour with conversation, and there is connection, and everybody longs for deep connection. You go out, you meet your friends, but for example, one of the characters here, she's married, she has kids, she has so many friends, and doesn't have a spare moment at all. Plus, she's having an affair, but she is so lonely. And it is only when you understand her grief and her loneliness that you understand her. If you look at her smiles and her partying, you don't understand her. You only understand people when you understand their specific kind of loneliness. And which is perhaps why, because when I was working, of course, I was working with those images and those memories. But when I'm writing these characters, I want to get at the heart of these characters, to get at their truth. And I couldn't do it without addressing their solitude, I think.
And yet there's also a self-awareness about each of the characters. You mentioned the lady who is sort of not visibly lonely, but she's sort of going out, she's meeting her friends, she's partying, her kitty party group is very sort of active. But she is acutely aware of how they are perceiving and judging, and sort of like curating herself for their appraisal. So is this, I would say, like, is this an effect of like, I'm sure you wrote these stories before lockdown and COVID happened, but like now that we have sort of broken these perceptions of like, curating ourselves for a gathering of people, do you think that what is left is just loneliness?
No, I don't think what is left is loneliness, but I do think that people do put up a lot of fronts, right? Like you use the word curating. So in a way, yes, this particular woman's life is curated in a sense. She curates her smiles, she curates her personality for others. When she is pushed to answer questions, she dismisses any kind of serious question about why are you happy, why are you sad. She'll immediately dismiss that by making a little joke out of it. She's full of gossip, full of everything. But while it is true that loneliness is one part of a problem, the other perhaps bigger problem in her life is the lack of connection. Very often, especially when now there is a kind of mental health discourse, particularly amongst the upper classes. I think there is this whole discourse about we should, this is a discourse of care, of caring for people and making sure that people are all right, being available for them, etc. But even when we talk about it, I don't think we're really there for people. in any real sense. We'll say I'm there for you, but are you?
I would have
You
to
know,
agree, yes.
yeah, they're there for you maybe to for what, half an hour, 1 hour. But what happens after that half an hour, 1 hour? A conversation can pull people back from the brink, and perhaps um, if at that particular time, if people had the, if you give people a moment of your time and they're at a very sort of on the brink, like at that time all they need is to be heard, and if you hear them they can pull back from the brink, or they may not be on the brink. Sometimes they just need to vent, right? They might be on the verge of doing something wrong, and you give them a little bit of an opportunity, or you tell them that don't do this right now, do this if you must, for example, leave the city, go looking for a new job, or they might be wanting to do something criminal, and you tell them that don't do this, have a little patience, etc., etc. A conversation can stop people, but a lot of times it doesn't, partly because that conversation doesn't happen, and partly because sometimes the problems are just too big. Economic problems, emotional problems. People's lives don't get overhauled just because you've had a conversation with someone. Deep connection can save people. This character, if her husband had insisted, absolutely insisted, on having a conversation in time, if her lover had had a conversation when she needed that conversation, perhaps things would not have turned out that way. There's another character, a woman, a housewife. If her husband had just understood, just seen her, no, just seen that she's struggling, and had just said, okay, what is it you need? And let's make some changes around here. If that had happened, perhaps their lives would have turned out differently, right? And everybody's, because everything is kind of building, right? If if for example, there is this woman who really wants a baby, but her husband will not allow her to quit her job because she doesn't have a baby. Now, what pushes her to the brink, right? What pushes her to the point that it's not the baby itself, it's everything, right? And I think that what everybody needs is to be seen and to be heard. And writing is one way of course, of trying to see, trying to listen to other people, people themselves being able to write. I mean, it's cathartic, it's therapeutic, it's all of those things. I think one of the things, perhaps, I mean, maybe not consciously, but in retrospect, I can think about it. And I think one of the things that people desperately need in metropolises is deep connection. Not just someone to talk to, not just someone to hang out with. We do have those people. Um, Mumbai, in fact, is fantastic in this way that little connections are very easy, actually. That's one of the things I adore about the city, or used to adore. I think that's changing now. The fact that you could make friends anywhere. You could make friends on the train, you could make friends on the bus, you could make friends just standing around on a platform, you could make friends outside of office, inside of office, and everybody had these multiple. So there's like these little rings around you. And I had a distinct sense when I first moved to the city that people here are actually less lonely than they are in other metropolises. I think people I've only lived in 2 or 3 other big cities, but I do think that by and large, people in Mumbai, maybe percentage wise, I don't know how to measure loneliness, right? How do you measure loneliness?
That is actually a wonderful quote. How do you measure loneliness?
Yeah, I have no way of doing it. But I have to say that I think people would be slightly less lonely because of these little connections. Deeper connections are harder to find. That is true, just as a factor of time, factor of distance in the city. But sometimes what you need is the little connection. You're feeling rotten. You hear 5 other women singing a film song in the train. Your spirits lighten just a little bit. Maybe you're 90% lonely, you start feeling, say, 70% lonely instead of 90% lonely, right? So I do think that the city offers us these very small opportunities to belong, to elevate our mood sometimes. But also think that it lacks the space, the social space as well as the space and discourse for deeper connections and conversations that would, I think, make life more meaningful, but sometimes even just save lives.
There are so many bits in your answer that I could pick up from. I have actually, but I need to get to one question that I had, which is that the city is unnamed and the narrators themselves don't particularly have any sort of identifying markers as such. They are sort of generically a kind of character. So is there a conscious decision to keep the anonymity? I know we discussed this previously, but I would like to sort of bring this out in a public forum. Like, was there a conscious decision not to name the city, even though it is obviously Mumbai? And was there a conscious decision not to name the characters or give them any sort of identifying markers?
Yes, the decision not to name was most definitely a conscious one. I've done this before, even with love stories, I think. And I think one of the things is that I personally find that I find it easier to get to the heart of characters if I don't name them. Particularly if I'm trying to get to a certain kind of emotional moment or truth with them. Because the moment you name them, their lives become circumscribed by their social circumstances. Now, a girl named Shania is very different from a girl named Lakshmi. Even though I've told you nothing, right? Nothing about that either girl. But just the fact that you have that particular name, or a girl named, Fatima might be very different from a girl named Fatto. Now, where does Fatima come from? Where does Fatto come from? Does Fatima also have a pet name called Fatto? But the moment I give her that name, in my head, immediately her family circumstances, her parents, her everything becomes kind of um, a little bit too obvious. And I'm saying this as a writer, I get lost in the detail of trying to circumscribe her in her social context or to try and define it in my writing. If I don't name her, I have the freedom of just getting to her heart, straight to her heart. Like, what is her mind? Where is she in this moment? Is she sitting in a train? Is she sitting on a bus? Is she sitting in an office? Maybe by the end of it, I want to give her a name. In this book, I don't. But I think if I'm trying to get to a certain interiority, then I find that leaving characters' names is easier for me personally. The city I left unnamed, well, I mean, people who are familiar with Mumbai know it is Mumbai, but I did also think that this could be another city. If somebody sitting in say, Sri Lanka wants to read a book, I wanted them to be able to identify with the characters and their lives, even if they're not. Maybe they don't know what a local train is, or maybe they don't know specifically that this kind of, like, say, a ladies' compartment. What does it look like, feel like? That I am describing for you. I'm taking you to the compartment so you can visualize it, you can be there. But I didn't want readers to react to this book as, this is a story of that city. I wanted them to read the book and feel like this could be my city. So that is why I leave the city unnamed. But of course, for anybody who has been to the city even once, they immediately know which city it is.
An earlier comment by you about the ladies who sing filmy songs on the train reminded me of several instances where you reference film music, films. Even the title of the book, if I'm not mistaken, is a very well-known film song. I'm not going to sing it because I don't want to be, but Hadson ka shahar hai, as they say. So that is what you have done as City of Incident. Is there like a reason why, obviously it's Mumbai, you cannot escape Bollywood here, but like so much of it informs the lives of the characters in there. They often um, sort of correlate themselves or have some sort of connection to songs, or all of that. So has it been that you consciously decided to put in so many references to like films within the book?
One is that I'm a very filmy person. I think uh, I grew up on Hindi films. Actually, I didn't grow up very filmy, to be honest, because my upbringing was such that my media consumption was quite tightly controlled.
So
But I saw more Hindi.
I assume that as a filmmaker, you had sort of decided that yes, I'm going to, as a filmmaker, reference this, that, and the other within the book.
I
I found myself often like translating some of the phrases like "lag ja gale ke fir ye hasi raat" like is pretty much translated in English, and I'm like humming it in my head as I read. So was there some connection that because you work in film, you try to bring film into the book?
No, I didn't think of it consciously, but I do think that if you live in Mumbai, some filmy influence is in unavoidable. It's simple things like um, when I first came to the city, I obviously didn't know anything, and I was just learning to negotiate trains, buses, taxis, and all that. And if I want to go somewhere to Juhu, for example, and I can't explain, I want to go to, for example, Prithvi Theatre. When I was quite young, I started to go to Prithvi Theatre, and whenever I had to explain to a cab guy or an auto guy that meko Prithvi jana hai, they wouldn't know where Prithvi is. So they would ask Kidhar. So I would try to, at that time you didn't even have like Google Maps or anything. So I would keep trying to say कि उधर से फिर दरिया के पास में फिर. And then they would always say कि अमिताभ के बंगले के पास है क्या? And I didn't know where Amitabh ka bangla was, right? So I had no context, but people did. Even now in Bombay, if you ask people, they'll say Shahrukh ke bangle ke paas kya, Amitabh ke bangle ke paas kya, Dilip Kumar ke bangle ke paas kya. And I was like, where are all these banglas? I don't know these banglas, right? But for people who are in the suburbs, these are very real things. Tourists do come from like everywhere, and they do come and stand outside Amitabh ka bangla, right? So it, this is normal even for people who are not really, say, big consumers or filmmakers or anything. Film world is ever present. Half the taxi drivers I've got talking to have run away from home to become film stars in Bombay. And I think a certain filminess, the reason why Hindi films appeal to us is also because it touches something in us, which it kind of, not only does it tell our stories back to us, I mean, all films do that, but I think film music particularly also influences, it binds us. You go to the fanciest discos, they'll be playing the Western music, whatever the current fad of the day is. But you see the electricity that passes through the room the moment they switch to Hindi music. People from South Bombay who would otherwise not admit to liking that music, you see something happens to their bodies, something changes about them. I do think it's kind of somewhere it's in our blood, it's in our DNA, the music. And of course, I mean, you ride the trains, you hear people singing. One of my most beautiful and startling memories of the city. I mean, I would get into train fights too. It's not all nice. I've gotten into fights. I've been hit by other women in the
There
ladies'
was that
compartment.
vivid description of the woman who got was hanging on while everyone was boarding the train, and I had such flashbacks because like first couple of times you take the local train, you are not aware that this is a thing that you must sort of stand to the side and let other people board, and the visceral description, like I felt that punch to the gut that she got.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. So these things happen. I still have a very faint scar from from being just from the crowds and people kind of women losing their cool in the train. And At the same time, one of the most pleasant memories I have is of people being very kind in the trains, people lifting you up, people being nice to you, people singing. Um, Before mobile phones and smartphones became a thing, this was very routine. Now I think people just either watch their TV dramas on their phones or they listen to their own music when everybody's going back home. But maybe even up to 5, 6 years ago, it was normal to have people playing Antakshari. And there are certain women's compartments which share a wall with the men's compartments. So, like through the jali, you can see each other. And I clearly remember once these people were singing, playing their own Antakshari. The men were singing, playing their own Antakshari. And at some point, both of them started playing across the jali. These people would sing, and then those people would sing. And those are things you don't find in any other city. And they kind of, I carry these memories around. So I do think that even when you don't, it's not visible. Like everybody who's listening to songs on their own headphones now, everybody's got their own whatever music playing. I can bet you anything that 95% of those people are listening to Hindi film songs. Maybe other film songs, maybe Marathi film songs or whatever, but I'm pretty sure 90% of them at least do listen to Hindi film music on their way back. And so you don't know it, but you are connected, by that similar thing. You sit in an auto and the auto guy is playing film songs. So I do think that films in that way connect us very fleetingly, but they connect us. There's something that binds us together.
Definitely. My maid, when she comes, like the minute she enters the house, she'll pull her mobile phone out and start the app. She knows Spotify. So she'll start the Spotify app and, merrily go around doing everything very happily because all her songs are playing. And of course, a funny thing that you should bring up the adjoining men's compartment, because one of the first sort of instances of a very peculiarly Bombay slang that I learned was when a male friend told me that compartments would share the sort of grill with the ladies compartment. Those compartments are called video compartments. And I was like, this is the most random thing ever. But it has a name. It has a, sort of
Because you
cachet.
can watch.
Yeah, because you can watch the ladies, so it's a video compartment, and there's a cachet, like men will wait to get into that compartment so that they can watch the ladies. And I found that so hilarious that even this tiny little detail of life has a sort of, identity, has a little, kind of moment in people's lives. And one of the things that I really wanted to sort of speak about is there a reason why that these sort of short stories are constructed so fleetingly brief, almost like a moment that you yourself are like viewing? Like there isn't much more than a bite-sized chunk, and then you're immediately sort of on to the next person before you get too attached or before you form too much of a connection. Like I really wanted to know the lady without her baby, the one who wanted a baby, how much she was going, how far she was going to go with the beggar, but she sort of drew back, and then we also kind of drew back with her. We drew back from the confrontation, we drew back from her sort of dilemma of what to do and her confusion, and then we're just left with that, and then we are again on to the next. So was there a reason why they are constructed in such sort of bite-sized chunks?
Yeah, I think one thing that I'm trying to do here is that locate those characters in a particular moment of time. So the first story, for example, the first chapter is this cop who's riding in the train. I don't give you his whole life there. I give you that day in his life. But that day in his life obviously does not mean just that day, because even like today you are sitting here, but you also carry all your years with you, all your memories with you in this one moment. And how much are you going to think about in this one moment? So that cop who's traveling in the train, he's in his uniform, he's carrying his rifle, he's feeling what he's feeling. But there are flashes of memories from other times that, and he's going to only be able to tell you so much of his life in that moment, right? The next chapter is that of another girl who's riding in the same compartment. She's looking at him. Their intersection is very fleeting, but she's interested in him. And I want to take the story forward in that way, that at this moment of time, she's only interested in him. She doesn't have a relationship with him, but she could, and she wants to. She's tempted, right? That there's this little bit of a temptation in her to initiate, even if he's married, she's tempted. The next story is of someone else, the next story. And if you, by the time you get to the end of the book, perhaps it's not immediately apparent, but by the end, you will see that the same characters do occur.
Come back.
Yeah. So you have a little hint of what may have happened to her, what she may have done, which you won't hear in that chapter, but maybe I've already told you in the first chapter about what has actually happened to her. You have to pay close attention to understand, of course, because I'm not using names. So you have to pay close attention to know that, okay, this is the same woman that he's talking about.
The one who got beaten up on the platform. We actually hear the end of the story in one of the earlier stories, and then we sort of come back to it. It's a very Rashomon style, unreliable narrator sort of construction. I was wondering, were there any influences? Like, did you maybe look at, I don't know, Italo Calvino, Boliano, or even Chaucer, and like consciously decide to construct it that way?
Not consciously, but I do think perspective matters a lot in my work, and I think that's just been happening without me planning it. It's been happening, multiple perspective kind of stories. I was writing this book alongside my novel before this one, Prelude to a Riot, and that also unfolds through different perspectives.
You have Prelude to a Riot, and then Bread Cactus came out, and then this one. So you have almost 3 in quick succession.
Yeah. Although this City of Incident took me, I was recently going back and looking at how long it is. Somebody asked me, so I went back and looked, and my first draft is when I began writing. It is late 2014. So I think I had begun to write not knowing ki novel hai kya hai, just I thought maybe it will be a short story, maybe it'll be something else. I often begin like that, not knowing what I'm doing. But I think the phase in which I was writing, somewhere between 2014 to kind of 2021, I've been thinking, I think my thinking perhaps has been a little bit fragmented. And I think that has affected the ways in which I pick up stories to tell, rather than stick with one single perspective. I tend to pick up on little things. Also because this particular book, because the inspirations came from fragments. So because they came from little memories, little images, that therefore the story is built up in that way. And I do think that, but one thing I think that particular to this book, I think also is that I knew I wanted to write a city book. I knew it doesn't need to be a cop story or a housewife story or a girl story who's just, who's had some bad luck and some good luck and whatever. I knew that the book needs to be about the city. And the city is made up of multiple people, right? I mean, anything that I have to say about the city is not about me. It needs to be about many people. So I think that particular, the theme kind of fed into the form and the structure. The motivation decided how it needs to be written, I think.
I also found this very sort of, I wonder if you did it consciously, but it came to me it came across to me this way, that because the narrator is a second person narrator, and it's almost as if the city is observing the lives of these people. And that is the one common denominator throughout the entire book. Is like it's almost as if the city is telling you these stories. The city is the unnamed sort of point of view that is observing these little details of everyone's life. It's the city which gets inside your head, and makes you feel the things that you feel. So, in that sense, I think this really stands as one of the sort of great city novels that have come out, even though you might not say it's like a novel in the very traditional sense of the word, because there isn't one sort of plot. Um, was the fact that you were writing poetry in any way sort of contributor to the fact that they are sort of these short little bite-sized pieces?
Well, thank you firstly for picking up on that. That in a way that is, maybe you have articulated it better than I have. In a way, that was my intention to kind of tell the stories of people as if they were being seen from the outside, by not by me, but by sort of the collective in a sense, which is the city. Poetry, I can't say for sure. I'm still a writer who is learning in many ways. I've never done just one form, and I think in the beginning I was doing a lot of city poems. When I started writing, I was doing mainly poetry, and looking back now, I think the first 5 or 10 years when I was in Mumbai, I think when I wrote about the city, I wrote poetry more than anything else. And I think maybe the shortness of my response there was in that sense similar, that it was momentary. It was focused on just describing that one image. Maybe that did feed in. I do think that I tend to write poetry when I'm most sad, I think. So when I'm trying to describe things, I tend not to write poetry. If my intention is merely to describe or to kind of build up characters, things like that, I write poetry, I think, when I myself am in a particular emotional state. It could be sadness, it could be anger. Sometimes it is anger too. I do think
Be
that
angry about recently.
a lot. A lot. I wrote this, but I do think it works the other way too. I think I've been writing prose poems more than I think. I think of them as prose poems, and many people look at them and I'm like, is this even poetry? But I wrote this poem in the form of a letter, which some bureaucrats have written to a minister, like a minister for urban affairs or something like that. And it is a letter, which is basically describing the bureaucrats' discomfort with young people having too much freedom in the city. And I'm using prose techniques, but it is poetry. Yeah, in a way, it's a found poem, because I was reading the newspaper and I saw some bureaucrat writing to the editor about expressing discomfort with, and I looked at the whole paper and I picked up stray phrases, like phrases that I found interesting, and I made a whole list of them, and then I worked them into a poem, and it took the form of that letter. So I think it works both ways. Sometimes the poetry feeds into the prose, but sometimes the prose also feeds back into the poetry.
I think one of the most, maybe because I have some familiarity with his work, but the minute the sort of chapter with the beggar started, I was getting real strong sort of influences of like Arun Kolatkar's poetry about Bombay, the Kala Ghoda poems, especially sort of feeding into the, the perspective of his sort of existence and his life. I think a particular one was the Barefoot Queen of the Crossroads from Kala Ghoda poem, which was such a, and the idea that, throughout years and space and time, we have these sort of universal experiences. Maybe it's cliche by now, I don't know, but Bombay sort of affects everyone differently, but at the same time, in some very specific, similar ways. Um, are there any other books about Bombay that sort of you would recommend, or you have come to in your sort of, even if it's nonfiction, or sort of people who you would consider to be sort of influential upon your writing and your work?
Yeah, I'm very glad you mentioned Kolatkar. He's one of my favorites too. I think of the city poems, even though his most famous work, Jejuri, is not about Bombay, but he is such a quintessential. He is a Bombay poet. You know, he's the. I don't think somebody from Jejuri could write Jejuri. You know, it needed to be somebody from a city like Mumbai, coming from the influences and the two separate streams, a bilingual poet like him who could write work, produce work like that. So I think little bits of everything feed in, and I do like the work, and from the beginning I have been very moved by the work of poets like Kolatkar, Nissim too. I like Nissim's work. I mean, even my contemporaries, there's Ranjit, there's Sampurna, they do the kind of work, and the ability to not just describe, but to focus on the particular, and to kind of
almost raise
describe,
a glass to
yeah,
sort of,
yeah, without losing the emotional quality of that. I mean, this is something that I really like in poets, who are able to do particular, um, without losing hold of the emotional particularity of that moment. You know, of course it's universal in the way all poetry is, but I think when people are trying to describe very universal things, they start to use images and words that are so universal that they almost have no meaning and no tone anymore. But a lot of Bombay poets continue to have that, and I admire that. And of course, it is an influence. Of the Bombay books, I mean, I've read a lot. I've read a lot of, I mean, people have written both nonfiction and fiction. I mean, there's, I think Kalpana Sharma has written about it. Daryl DeMonte wrote about it. Suketu Mehta has, of course, written a big book. Sacred Games is a very big Bombay book. I mean, it's whatever else drama, etc., there is in that book, but it is finally a book about the city, which I really do like. Vikram Chandra's earlier book also I liked. In some ways, I think I like it more than even Sacred Games.
Love and Longing in Bombay.
Love and Longing, yeah.
Right.
And Arundhati Subramaniam's poetry about Bombay also I like a lot. I mean, and I've also read a lot of Delhi books, which I like, and just city books. I like urban books that are focused on experiences of the city. It doesn't need to position itself as a city book. Doesn't need to say that I'm a Bombay book, but books that, for example, there is this very little known and really marvelous. I mean, maybe is it a long short story? Is it a novella? I don't know. It's called Tyanantar. There's this Marathi writer called Sania. I don't read Marathi, but the novella was translated into English as Thereafter. OUP was doing a series of novellas by women writers, and it was part of that series. Tyanantar is such an urban book. It is, and very internal. I would say that in terms of tonality, perhaps I identify most with that kind of writing, where it's telling the story of a relationship in a city in a very quiet way, examining the drama of the breakdown of a relationship. So I really like that. I also really like, I don't know if it's not about Bombay. Nabanita Sen's work, a lot of it is urban. It is often about women, the characters she describes, etc. But it is urban. The sensibility is urban very often. Even if she's writing a travelogue, she carries her own sensibility with it. And it is a very cosmopolitan sensibility. And I like her work quite a bit as well. Uh, so yeah, that all of that, I think.
I also want to speak to you since you brought up translation, and I have sort of looked into it. You sort of have this thing going on, which is the Jawad Memorial Prize for Translation. Is that correct? Can you speak to us a bit about it? Like, how did you sort of think this up? What was the sort of reason behind instituting such a prize? And what is the importance of translation, I would say, because a lot of people are not aware that translators do real work. They are almost writing a second version of the same thing. Could you sort of expand upon that? Because I think a lot of people may not be aware or may not have an idea about what importance translation has.
Yeah. So the Jawad Prize I named for my grandfather. His name was Ali Jawad Zaidi. He is my maternal grandfather, and he was multilingual in the sense that he not only knew but wrote in more than one language. Urdu, of course, was his main kind of language, but he did know Persian as well and Arabic, and he wrote in English too. He's written for the Sahitya Academy. He wrote a book called The History of English Literature. Worked on multiple projects, some in English, some in Hindi, but he was a poet, primarily a poet, but he also did a lot of scholarly work, and some of that scholarly work was in English. And I, even despite being his granddaughter, I didn't grow up with Urdu. I grew up mainly only in the English mold, in the sense that I read almost exclusively in English. I came to Urdu literature very late in life. It's only now that I've begun to learn the actual script, and I have only been able to consume poetry because it is available in either the Devanagari script or the Roman English script. But I was always curious. And I think that if he hadn't done the work of translation, of scholarship, of making older work that is already lost, or older trends in literature that he wrote commentaries on, if he hadn't done that, I think there would have been a great loss, really, to the world of letters, etc. And I thought initially about, I wanted to do something in his memory. I didn't have any money. I still don't have much. But I wanted to do something very small and as a small token of keeping his spirit and his work alive. And I thought about, should I do a original prize for poetry? But then I also thought about it and about that, how is that going to serve the world of literature, not just Urdu literature, but all literatures? And what is it that's lacking currently in our understanding of Urdu literature? And I think one of the problems is that lots of work doesn't get translated. Absolutely. The big names get translated. Now that's happening. Like famous writers, their works may come out. Not enough. And because the body of work is so big, and we know almost nothing about it. So everybody's heard of Manto now, but even that is because Manto's got translated within the last 20 years. In his own lifetime, he wasn't translated. And I saw that there is a gap. So I can't afford to do a prize big enough, say, for the translation of a whole book or for new original writing. But I saw that, okay, I can afford to maybe do something very small, which will encourage the beginning of a translation. So individual essays, individual short story translation is, so far, that's what we've been doing. I mean, I have the support of my family, but I mean, not enough yet to be able to do anything bigger than this. But what we want is to do something sustainable. So it's better to do one small prize for one short story and to do it consistently than to announce something big and then not to be able to do it over and over. Translation, I think, does serve this very, very, I mean, some of the greatest literature I've read has been in English, but translated works. I mean, you mentioned Calvino before. I love Calvino, but I haven't even read all his work. But whatever little I've read has been because of translators. Umberto Eco. I mean, where would we be? Everybody's crazy about Elena Ferrante. How would we be able to access her work without translation? Or some of my favorite writers are Hindi writers, but I first read them in translation. I can read Hindi, but it's only when I first found a poem or a short story in translation that I said, okay, I like this, I'm going to read it in the original. And I want to be able I want to, for this to happen in all languages, but obviously the ones that I'm connected with first. So yeah, that is why the prize.
I was thinking about this because I think I had visited Lucknow when I was staying with a friend, and she took me to Mr. Ram Advani's bookshop, which at the time he was alive was an institution. And I was browsing the books, and I asked him about anything I should read, especially about Lucknow. And he first gave me a book in Urdu, and I said, I do not know how to read it. He said, well, how are you going to read about Lucknow if you don't know how to read Urdu? So then he finally handed me The Essence of Camphor, a series of short stories, again in translation from Urdu. And that's how I sort of became, yes, and that's how I sort of became acquainted with that city in a way. And I always think about this, that if it wasn't for the fact that someone had sat and done all those, and it was beautiful, almost magical realism in a way, predating Latin American magical realists. Like, we have such a long tradition of it. So I feel like all these things get short shrift when, it's sort of either you don't read it and it's neglected. There are plenty of documents, if I might mention Asiatic here, there are plenty of documents within the Asiatic sort of archives that are untranslated, or only scholars sort of know them and translate them, and then they're not sort of read by the wider public because there's no edition brought out by the wider public. So such things do sort of matter, and I feel they're very important in the future, because then we're losing sort of vast swaths of knowledge because they have not been brought out in English or Hindi or whatever. So I really feel that's something that we should pay attention to when we read, write, try to consume literature in other languages. If you can't, try to look for translations. And the work of a translator is a very important one. So thank you so much for doing that. I also think, thank you for sitting with us this long. It's 8:15. I think let's start taking questions. Otherwise, I'll be accused of, just chatting with you and letting this all run over time. So I think the first question is from Vispi Balaporia, Mrs. Balaporia herself. Can the city be seen as a character in the novel rather than the setting of the novel?
Well, I mean, you could, but I think perhaps what Sharon herself said, it is not so much a character as, and not even so much of a setting as an observer, because I don't think of a city as a place. It is a place. For example, Mumbai is a city by the sea. You can't envision it or relate to it without taking that into account. So the geography is important, but finally, a city is people. You can't have, you can have place settings, but you cannot have cities without people. Cities are made up of people. So I do think of, when I think of the city, I think of the character of its people, and individual characters in the city, yes, but also not just stereotypes, not just, like those unity and diversity kind of visual palettes that are done where you show 5 people wearing different costumes, not that, but their emotional diversity, the different circumstances in which they find themselves, some happy, some maybe not so happy, some lucky, some unlucky, migrants, most of them are migrants for various reasons. maybe a first generation migrant, maybe a 10th generation migrant, but ultimately we all are.
Generation migrant.
Yeah. So I do think that the city is simultaneously many of the characters and simultaneously also an observer of these characters. We all look at each other. We all wonder about each other. You pass someone on the street, as much as I'm wondering about them, they're also probably wondering about me. Sometimes I become the instigator of a fight. Sometimes I observe a fight. Sometimes I see someone cry. Sometimes other people see me cry. So I think in that sense, I do think that the city is more active in both seeing and being the seen in this book.
All right. Any other questions? Otherwise, I will continue chatting with Annie, and you all can keep sort of adding your questions into the chat box. Yes, Mrs. Balapuria, any questions further? No. Okay. I just wanted to ask you, in a way, do you have any sort of specific, I know it's a very cliche question that gets asked all the time, but this is important because, you've published poems, and now this is basically sort of like a hybrid short story / novel. And, you always hear like poems don't sell, novels don't sell, this constant refrain from publishers. And I do know and see some other people who've written and published short stories within the chat. Is there any reason or any way where someone who wants to write can approach or speak to publishers about publishing, let's say, a set of short stories around a theme or a set of novels around the theme? I'm asking for the young college kids who might want to do something in a similar vein, but obviously get this a lot, saying that short stories are not, sold and people are not reading. But I think it's the opposite now, because the pandemic has shortened everyone's attention spans to the degree where you cannot read anything longer than like the length of an Instagram post, for example. So what are your thoughts about that, and what would your advice be to somebody?
So there is a problem. Publishers are reluctant. Poetry is at the bottom of the pile, everybody's pile, which is surprising because so many people write poetry. Everybody wants to write it. Nobody wants to buy it. So publishers are naturally reluctant to publish it. And in fact, I was quite upset last time when I was out in Mumbai. I'd walked into one of the bookstores, major bookstores. They had done away completely with the poetry section. I wanted to buy a book of poetry,
Yes.
but the shelf was gone. Not even one shelf. And then they said a few books, and the few books they had were all by Gulzar. And and they were all put on the shelf with plays. And I was like, how can you do this? How can you just lump poetry with plays? And I think plays suffer from in the same way, that Bombay at least does have a thriving kind of play scene, but nobody wants to publish them anymore. So they put in just one small shelf, and whatever 5 or 6 books, plays will be all Shakespeare and Shaw, poetry will be Gulzar and one other person, maybe I don't know, somebody's sonnets, and that's it. That's the shelf. So that is a problem. There is a problem of publishing, distribution, retail, all of that. I don't blame the publishers alone, because it is a fact that people tend not to buy as much.
It's a business at the end of the day.
It's a business. With short stories too, people often say that this is not so much that people don't read short stories. I think all put together, people probably read more short stories than they read novels, but they don't buy as many collections of short stories. And I think people have tried to get around it, especially in the digital world. They're trying to get around it by breaking them down into, people have done all these experiments. My own publishers tried to do these experiments, that they'll sell a single short story for 20 rupees or 15 rupees or something like that. People still don't buy it, even though it's only 15 rupees. So I think the challenge is the positioning and the marketing of the book, rather than, if you're doing short stories, you should be able to package it as a book and not as, as disconnected short stories. So those short stories need to have uh, a common theme, for example, or they need to be very unusual so that whatever the one or two very popular stories kind of are stand out, and then maybe the publisher gets interested if they see that there's even one remarkable story that everybody's very impressed by. Those kind of negotiations have to be made, but it's not like just because you've written a novel instead, it'll be that much easier. The advances are going to be as small, the print runs are going to be as small. Um, Finally, it does come down to quality, though. I have to tell you this, that when you're setting out, when you're a very young person and you're setting out, the one thing that will get a publisher's attention or approval will be the quality of the work. It is better to write 3 exceptional short stories than write 1 mediocre novel. It is much better. I mean, don't aspire for the novel just because you think publishers may be more interested. Even if they end up publishing you, nobody will read you. So what's the point? You A very good example, for example, is Danielle Marinode. He's this quite famous writer now. His first book was, I mean, it received international attention, etc. But it is short stories, and he started out getting published in the New Yorker, which is everybody's dream, of course. If you write short stories, everybody wants to be published by the New Yorker, the New York Times, or someplace like that.
Paris Review.
The Paris Review, yes, all the big international places. So everybody wants that. It may not happen, but even if you don't have to crack the New Yorker. Even if you manage to publish one very good story somewhere in a journal, in a magazine, an editor is more likely to see that and accept your work than they are to read a kind of wishy-washy attempt at a novel. So the work speaks for itself. Poetry, I have no advice to give anyone because I struggle myself. I haven't managed to put together a manuscript. I haven't managed to publish. So.
All right. Any other questions from anyone else, or should we sort of end this on time? I have some names to read out before we wrap up. So if nobody has any questions, I will just sort of go through a list of winners. So Richi Tatkare, Emadri Ludbe, Alina Qureshi have won a copy of City of Incident for their paper presentations on behalf, like for the Asiatic. Shashank Tyagi, Hem Maradia, Abhishek Malik are also quiz winners, and they win copies of the City of Incident. This is because Annie very kindly waived her speaking fee and let us know that she would prefer her copies of her books to be given out to participants who are active and sort of doing work with the Asiatic. And I think that's a very, very generous gesture from Annie's side. So thank you so much, Annie.
And no, thank you. I hope that whoever's getting the book will enjoy it.
Thank you very much. And thank you for sort of taking time out and sitting with us on this. I hope this has been a fun time for you. And
it has been. It has been. Thank you so much. It's been a very rewarding conversation.
I hope this has also been interesting for all of our audience and participants. And I would also like to thank Mrs. Balapuria for taking time out and sort of being with us today. And thank you for introducing us. All right. And with that, I'll sort of bring this to a close if nobody has anything further to say. All right, then. So with that, I wish you all good night and end this meeting, right? Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Annie.
Thank you. Thanks, Sharon. And thank you, Asiatic.
Madhu ma'am, you there?